The heat was bad enough to melt the rubber off your sneakers, but that wasn't what stopped traffic. It was the armored black Lincoln T-boned and deadlocked in the middle of the intersection. Inside, an 80-year-old woman was suffocating. Dozens of people stood around on the asphalt. Nobody helped. They just pulled out their phones to film. They didn't know the car belonged to the deadliest man in the city. And they didn't know a broke, exhausted widow was about to take a tire iron to his world. The dashboard clock in Sarah's rusted Honda Civic read 3:14 p.m. The air conditioning had died 3 summers ago, right around the time her husband's heart gave out. Now the only breeze came from the rolled-down windows, carrying the scent of hot asphalt exhaust fumes and the rotting garbage from the alleyways of Southside. Traffic hadn't moved an inch in 20 minutes. Sarah wiped a line of sweat from her collarbone with the back of a calloused hand. She was running late for her second shift at the diner. If she missed clock-in, she'd lose the holiday bonus, which meant she'd lose the apartment. It was that simple. Life since Tom passed wasn't a tragedy. It was a spreadsheet. A constant grinding math problem where the numbers never worked in her favor. Up ahead, a cacophony of car horns blared, layered over the low murmur of a gathering crowd. People were getting out of their cars. Sarah threw the Civic into park, the transmission grinding in protest. She stepped out onto the boiling street. The sun beat down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She pushed through the stagnant lines of idling vehicles craning her neck. At the center of the intersection sat a massive matte black Lincoln Continental. A commercial delivery box truck had slammed into its passenger side. The truck driver was sitting on the curb, clutching his bleeding forehead, arguing with a dispatcher on his phone. The Lincoln, however, was the real spectacle. It was built like a tank. The metal wasn't crushed so much as dented, but the impact had triggered something catastrophic in the vehicle's electrical system. The engine was smoking a thick, acrid, black plume spiraling into the July sky. All 4 doors were shut tight. The windows, thick and heavily tinted, were rolled up. "Someone called the fire department." A guy in a tailored suit yelled from a safe distance, holding an iced coffee. "I called 10 minutes ago." A woman next to him replied, her phone held up, recording the smoking car. "Dispatch says they're backed up. 10-car pileup on the interstate." Sarah moved closer. The heat radiating off the Lincoln's black hood was staggering. Through the spiderwebbed cracks on the driver's side window, she saw a man slumped over the steering wheel. Unconscious. Blood soaked his white collar. But it was the back seat that made her stomach drop. The tint was dark, but the sun caught a pale, trembling hand pressing against the glass. Behind the reinforced window was an elderly woman. Her face was flushed dark red, her mouth open in a desperate, silent scream for air. The smoke from the engine compartment was beginning to seep through the air vents into the cabin. The interior of that black car in 100-degree heat was becoming an oven. "Hey!" Sarah shouted, turning to the crowd of onlookers. "There's an old lady in there. She's suffocating. We have to get the doors open." A teenager in a backward cap shrugged, not lowering his phone. "Doors are jammed, lady. Look at the locks. It's an armored car. Some guy already tried pulling the handle. So we break the window." Sarah yelled, her voice cracking with a sudden violent rage. It wasn't just the heat. It was the sheer grotesque apathy. Dozens of people, dozens of cameras, not one hand lifted. "With what?" The suit scoffed. "It's bulletproof glass. You're going to hurt yourself. Just wait for the pros." Sarah didn't argue. She turned on her heel, sprinting back through the maze of cars to her Civic. She popped the trunk. It squealed on dry hinges. Underneath a pile of unpaid medical bills and a pair of worn-out winter boots, she found Tom's old tire iron. It was heavy-forged steel, wrapped in peeling grip tape. By the time she made it back to the Lincoln, the old woman's hand had slid down the glass. She was fading. "Stand back," Sarah growled. The crowd muttered, taking a few collective steps away, eager for the new show. Sarah gripped the iron with both hands. She wasn't strong. She was tired, chronically underfed, and running on nothing but cheap coffee and grief. But she squared her shoulders, took a breath of the smog-choked air, and swung the heavy steel bar as hard as she could at the rear driver's side window. Clang! The reverberation shot up Sarah's arms, rattling her teeth. The iron bounced off. The glass didn't even chip. Someone in the crowd laughed. A short, ugly sound. Sarah ignored it. She looked closely at the glass. The impact from the truck had warped the door frame slightly, creating a point of immense tension near the top left corner of the window. She adjusted her grip. She thought of Tom dying in a sterile hospital room while the nurses changed shifts. She thought of the eviction notice taped to her door. She thought of the absolute unfairness of a world that watched people suffocate because it made good content. She swung again, aiming for the stress point. Crack! A sharp, jagged line shot through the reinforced laminate. Holy shit! Someone muttered. Sarah swung a third time. Her muscles burned, her lungs heaving. The steel bit into the fractured glass. The webbing spread like frost. With a final guttural yell, she drove the pointed end of the tire iron directly into the center of the spiderweb. The structural integrity gave way. The thick, laminated glass caved inward with a sickening crunch. Toxic, superheated air blasted out of the hole, hitting Sarah in the face. It smelled of melting plastic and sweat. She didn't hesitate. She used the iron to clear the jagged edges, tearing her knuckles on a shard of glass. Blood welled up, dripping down her fingers, but she barely felt it. She reached through the shattered window, unlocked the heavy locking mechanism manually from the inside, and yanked the heavy door open. The elderly woman slumped sideways, practically falling into Sarah's arms. She felt like a bundle of fragile, overheated twigs wrapped in expensive silk. "I got you," Sarah gasped, buckling under the dead weight, dragging the woman away from the smoking chassis. "I got you. You're okay?" Sarah dragged the old woman to the sparse shade of a bus stop shelter on the sidewalk. The concrete was filthy, covered in discarded gum and cigarette butts, but it was out of the sun. The woman's chest heaved erratically. Her skin was terribly dry, lacking any sweat, a severe sign of heat stroke. She wore a tailored charcoal dress and a string of pearls that probably cost more than Sarah's life insurance payout. "Water!" Sarah barked at the crowd. "Someone give me some damn water." The guy in the suit hesitated, then stepped forward, offering his half-empty bottle of Evian. Sarah snatched it, unscrewed the cap, and carefully poured a little over the old woman's wrists and the back of her neck. "Hey," Sarah said softly, patting the woman's cheek. "Stay with me. Keep your eyes open." The woman's eyelids fluttered. They were a piercing, cloudy grey. She looked up at Sarah, taking in the cheap, faded diner uniform, the messy brown hair plastered to her forehead, and the blood steadily dripping from Sarah's right hand. Slowly, a gnarled hand reached up and gripped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "Grazie." The woman rasped, her voice thick with a heavy Italian accent. "Mille grazie." "Just breathe," Sarah said, sitting on the dirty concrete beside her, suddenly overwhelmingly exhausted. Her adrenaline was crashing. Her hand throbbed with a dull, vicious ache. The sound of sirens finally cut through the heavy city air. But it wasn't a fire engine. It was a convoy of 3 identical jet-black SUVs. They didn't navigate the traffic. They forced their way through. They drove over the raised concrete median tires, tearing up the sparse grass, and slammed to a halt, forming a perfect barricade around the smoking Lincoln and the bus stop. The crowd went dead silent. Phones were slowly lowered. The atmosphere in the intersection shifted from voyeuristic excitement to sheer suffocating terror. The doors of the SUVs opened in unison. Men poured out. They were broad-shouldered, wearing dark suits despite the blistering heat. They moved with military precision, forming a perimeter. One of them, a massive guy with a scarred jaw, yanked the unconscious driver from the Lincoln and began assessing his wounds. Then the back door of the lead SUV opened. Dominic Gallo stepped out onto the asphalt. He didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. There was no flashy jewelry, no cigar, no exaggerated swagger. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit without a tie, the collar unbuttoned. He was in his mid-30s, tall with sharp, brutal features and eyes the color of dark flint. He radiated a cold, controlled violence that made the sweltering air feel like it had frozen solid. The onlookers physically backed away. A few people turned and practically ran back to their cars. Everyone in this city knew who the Gallos were. They owned the ports, the unions, and half the judges. Dominic's eyes scanned the wreckage of the Lincoln, his jaw locking. Then his gaze snapped to the bus stop. He moved. He didn't run, but his strides ate up the distance. The men in suits parted for him instantly. Sarah stayed sitting on the ground, one hand still holding the water bottle, the other bleeding onto the pavement. She looked up at him as he towered over them. Dominic dropped to his knees, heedless of the dirt ruining his trousers. His cold demeanor fractured for a split second, revealing raw, unadulterated panic. "Nonna," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. He reached out his large hands, gently framing the old woman's face. "Nonna, are you hurt? Did they hit you?" Rosa Gallo swatted his hand away with the feeble annoyance of a woman who had raised him from a boy. "Sto bene, Dominic." She coughed. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Sarah. "The girl. She broke the glass. The rest of these cowards just watched me cook." Dominic froze. Slowly he turned his head and looked at Sarah. Up close his eyes were terrifying. They were calculating, entirely devoid of warmth, taking in every detail of her. He looked at her stained apron, the cheap name tag that read, Sarah the grease in her hair, and finally the bleeding, torn knuckles on her right hand. Then he looked at the heavy steel tire iron lying on the pavement a few feet away. Sarah met his gaze. She didn't flinch. She was too tired to be scared. He was just another obstacle in a day full of them. "You're bleeding," Dominic stated. It wasn't a question of concern. It was an observation of fact. "Glass is sharp," Sarah replied flatly. She pushed herself up to her feet, wincing as her knees popped. "She needs a hospital. Heat stroke can be delayed. The driver needs an ambulance too." Dominic stood up, looming over her. He was at least a foot taller. "My people will handle the medical. What is your name?" "Sarah Hayes." She didn't offer her hand. It was bleeding anyway. Dominic reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet and withdrew a thick stack of $100 bills. He held it out to her. Sarah stared at the money. It was more cash than she made in 3 months. It would pay off the rent. It would keep the lights on. It would buy her breathing room. She looked from the money to Dominic's impassive face. She saw the expectation there, the assumption that everything had a price, and that a diner waitress from the South Side would practically kiss his shoes for the handout. Something ugly and proud flared in Sarah's chest. Tom had died because they couldn't afford a specialist. Money was a weapon in this city, and this man wielded it to make everything go away. "Keep it," Sarah said, her voice dry as dust. Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly. A fractional shift in his expression. "Take the money, Miss Hayes. You saved my grandmother's life. I don't like owing debts." "Then you'll have to learn to live with one," Sarah said. She turned her back on him, walking over to her rusted Civic. She picked up the tire iron, threw it in the trunk, and slammed it shut. She got into the driver's seat. The men in suits were blocking her path. She honked the horn. It sounded pathetic and wheezy. Dominic stood by the bus stop, watching her. For a long moment the street was dead silent, except for the idling engines of his SUVs. Then he raised 2 fingers. The men instantly stepped aside. Sarah put the car in gear and drove away, leaving a trail of blue exhaust smoke behind her. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. The diner smelled heavily of stale, grease-bleached countertops and burnt coffee. It was a smell deeply embedded in Sarah's pores, a perfume of the working poor. It was Tuesday 2 days since the incident at the intersection. Sarah's right hand was wrapped in thick white gauze, the knuckles stiff and throbbing every time she carried a tray of heavy ceramic plates. She was running on 4 hours of sleep. The eviction notice was still firmly stuck to her apartment door, a neon-pink reminder of her failures. "Table 4 needs a refill, Sarah," muttered Gary, the diner manager. He was a balding, perpetually anxious man who usually barked orders, but today his voice was hushed. He kept glancing nervously at the front windows. "On it." Sarah sighed, grabbing a glass pot of decaf. She walked over to the booth, poured the coffee, and offered a tight, practiced smile to the elderly couple sitting there. As she turned back toward the counter, she noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. The low hum of breakfast chatter had evaporated. The clinking of silverware stopped. Sarah looked toward the entrance. A man stood just inside the doorway. He wasn't Dominic Gallo, but he clearly belonged to the same species. He wore a sharply tailored grey suit that cost more than the diner's annual revenue. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with silver hair slicked back and a nose that had been broken and reset badly more than once. His posture was perfectly relaxed, which somehow made him look incredibly dangerous. Gary was trembling behind the cash register. Can I help you, sir?" The man ignored Gary completely. His eyes swept the room, landing on Sarah. He walked toward her, his leather shoes silent on the sticky linoleum floor. "Sarah Hayes," the man said. His voice was gravelly polite, but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. "That's me," Sarah said, keeping her grip on the coffee pot. "I'm working. If you want a table seat yourself." A ghost of a smile touched the man's lips. "My name is Victor. I work for Dominic Gallo." A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the oxygen out of the diner. A few regulars at the counter looked down at their plates, suddenly deeply interested in their eggs. Nobody looked at Victor. "I remember Mr. Gallo," Sarah said evenly. "I told him we were square." "Mr. Gallo has a different accounting system," Victor said. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. He placed it gently on the Formica counter next to Sarah. "He insists you take this." Sarah stared at the envelope. It was unsealed. Inside, she could see the distinct, crisp edges of a cashier's check. "I don't want his money." "Victor," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "I pulled an old woman out of a hot car. I didn't perform a hit for the mob. Tell your boss to keep his charity." Victor didn't move to take the envelope back. "It isn't charity. It's gratitude. Rosa is the matriarch of our family. You preserved her life when a street full of animals watched her suffocate. Dominic does not ignore such things." "I have tables to serve," Sarah said stubbornly. She turned her back on him, walking toward the kitchen double doors. "The check is for $200,000, Miss Hayes." Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. The number hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. 200,000. It was an astronomical sum. It was the hospital bills wiped clean. It was a new apartment. It was a life where she didn't have to calculate the cost of a carton of eggs. She slowly turned back around. Victor was watching her carefully. "Why?" she asked, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Because a Gallo always pays their debts," Victor replied smoothly. "And because Dominic wishes to speak with you. Tonight, 7 o'clock. I will have a car waiting outside your apartment." "I'm not going anywhere with you, and I'm not meeting him," Sarah said, the panic starting to flare, masquerading as anger. "Take the damn check back." Victor finally reached out and tapped the envelope with one manicured fingernail. "I highly suggest you deposit this, Sarah, and I highly suggest you are ready at 7. Dominic doesn't handle rejection well. He wishes to thank you personally in a proper setting. That is all." He turned and walked out of the diner. The bell above the door jingled merrily, a stark contrast to the heavy dread he left behind. Gary rushed over the second the door closed, his face pale and sweating. "Sarah, what the hell did you do? Do you know who that was? That's Victor Russo. He's Gallo's underboss. Are you out of your mind? Take the money." Sarah stared at the cream-colored envelope sitting next to a puddle of spilled syrup. Her injured hand throbbed. She reached out and picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive. She didn't want any part of their world. She knew how this worked. Men like Dominic Gallo didn't just give away wealth out of the goodness of their hearts. They bought people. They bought loyalty. They bought silence. If she took this money, she was on his ledger forever. But as she looked around the miserable, grease-stained diner and thought of the pink eviction notice waiting at home, the cynical reality of her life crashed down on her. Principles were a luxury for people who could afford rent. At 6:55 p.m. that evening, Sarah stood on the curb outside her dilapidated brick apartment building. She hadn't deposited the check. It was folded securely in her cheap vinyl purse. She wore the best clothes. She owned a pair of dark jeans, a plain black blouse, and a worn leather jacket. It wasn't dinner attire, but she wasn't going to play dress-up for a gangster. Exactly at 7, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down. Victor was in the driver's seat. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her. Sarah opened the back door and slid onto the plush leather seats. It smelled of expensive cologne and new car smell. The doors locked automatically with a heavy final thunk. "Where are we going?" she asked, staring out the window at her grim neighborhood as it began to blur past. "To the estate," Victor said calmly. "Dominic is expecting you for dinner." Sarah crossed her arms, her jaw set tight. She wasn't going to be bought, and she wasn't going to be intimidated. But as the town car merged onto the highway, leaving the poverty of the South Side behind and heading toward the sprawling mansions on the cliffs overlooking the bay, she realized with a cold certainty that her life of quiet desperation was over. She had smashed a window, and in doing so had broken down the wall between herself and the most dangerous man in the city. The iron gates of the Gallo estate swung open with a heavy, oiled silence. The town car glided up a long driveway lined with ancient, meticulously manicured oak trees. The property sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, isolated from the city's grime by miles of private forest. The house itself was a sprawling limestone mansion, stark and imposing against the twilight sky. There were no warm porch lights, just security cameras, their red LEDs blinking rhythmically in the dusk. Victor parked near a set of double mahogany doors. Two men in dark suits stepped out of the shadows, their eyes scanning the perimeter before nodding to Victor. Sarah stepped out of the car. The ocean breeze was cool, cutting through her thin leather jacket. She gripped her cheap vinyl purse tighter, feeling the sharp corners of the envelope pressing against the fabric. "Inside," Victor murmured, gesturing toward the entrance. The interior was aggressively silent. The foyer featured marble floors that echoed with every step, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and expensive cigars. There were no photographs on the walls, no signs that a family actually lived here. It felt more like a fortress disguised as a museum. Victor led her down a long hallway and pushed open a set of frosted glass doors. It was a dining room dominated by a massive walnut table built to seat 20. Tonight it was set for 3. Dominic Gallo sat at the head of the table. He wore a dark button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose thick forearms, roped with muscle and faded ink. He was typing on a tablet, the blue light reflecting in his dark eyes. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he commanded. The word was quiet, yet it demanded immediate compliance. Sarah didn't sit. She walked halfway down the length of the table, stopped and unclasped her purse. She pulled out the cream-colored envelope and tossed it onto the polished wood. It slid across the table, stopping inches from Dominic's tablet. Dominic finally looked up. His expression was dangerously blank. "I told you," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the thudding in her chest. "I don't want your money. I don't want to be on your payroll, and I don't want to be a line item in your ledger." Victor shifted slightly by the door. Dominic raised a single finger, and the older man stepped back into the hallway, pulling the doors shut behind him. They were alone. Dominic picked up the envelope. He tapped it against his thumb, leaning back in his chair. $200,000 is a considerable amount of pride, Miss Hayes. Most people in your position would have cashed this before the bank even opened. "My position," Sarah fired back. "You mean poor. You mean desperate. I mean practical." Dominic set the envelope down. "I had my people look into you. Sarah Hayes, 31, widowed 3 years ago. Medical debt from your late husband's cancer treatments drained your savings. You work 60 hours a week at a diner that violates half a dozen health codes, and you're currently facing eviction. You need this money." A hot, ugly flush crept up Sarah's neck. The casual violation of her privacy felt like a physical slap. "You have no right to look into my life. I have every right to know who is interacting with my family." Dominic said, his tone devoid of apology. "You saved my grandmother. In my world, that creates a bond. A debt. Debts left unpaid foster weakness. You will take the money, and we will consider the matter settled. In my world," Sarah countered, leaning over the heavy wooden chair. "Taking money from a man like you means I owe you. It means if you ever need a favor or a safe house or a blind eye, you come knocking. I buried my husband. I don't need a bullet in my head because I cashed a mobster's check. Keep it." She turned toward the door. "Sarah." The voice didn't come from Dominic. It was raspy, frail, and heavy with an Italian lilt. Sarah stopped and looked toward a side door. Rosa Gallo stood in the archway, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. She wore a dark, elegant dress, a cashmere shawl draped over her fragile shoulders. She looked pale, the physical toll of the heat stroke still lingering around her eyes, but her gaze was sharp. "Nonna," Dominic said, standing up immediately. He moved toward her, his imposing frame suddenly deferential. "You should be resting." "I will rest when I am dead, Dominic." Rosa snapped gently, waving him off. She shuffled toward Sarah. Sarah instinctively stepped forward, closing the distance to offer an arm, catching herself before she touched the older woman. Rosa noticed. A small, genuine smile cracked her weathered face. "You did not cash the check," Rosa observed, looking at the envelope on the table. "No, ma'am," Sarah said softly. "Good," Rosa said. She turned to her grandson. "I told you, Dominic, you cannot buy everyone. Some people still have spines." Dominic's jaw tightened. "Nonna, she needs respect." Rosa interrupted, pointing her cane at the chair next to Sarah. "Sit down, child. You look like you were going to fall over. Did you eat today?" I had some toast," Sarah admitted, suddenly feeling the hollow ache in her stomach. "Sit," Rosa commanded, pulling out a chair for herself. Reluctantly, Sarah sat. Dominic returned to the head of the table, his eyes darting between the two women, clearly out of his element. "My grandson is a blunt instrument," Rosa said smoothly, as a silent maid appeared from a side door, placing bowls of steaming pasta and roasted vegetables on the table. "He solves problems with force and capital. He does not understand that true gratitude requires a personal cost. I don't want gratitude, Sarah said, staring at the rich food, her mouth watering despite herself. I just want to go back to my life. Rosa picked up her fork, her cloudy eyes locked onto Sarah's. That, my dear, is the one thing you cannot do. Sarah stopped chewing. She looked at Rosa, then at Dominic. The silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. What does that mean? Sarah asked. Dominic set his fork down. The subtle deference he showed his grandmother vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating operator she had met on the asphalt. The truck that hit my grandmother's car was not an accident, Dominic stated. Sarah's blood ran cold. The driver, he was bleeding. He looked terrified. He was terrified because he failed to finish the job, Dominic corrected smoothly. He was paid by a rival family, the Morettis. They wanted to send a message. They intended to trap my grandmother in that armored vehicle and let the heat kill her. It would have looked like a tragic malfunction following a standard traffic collision. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. The casual description of murder, of trapping an old woman in an oven, made her skin crawl. Why are you telling me this? Dominic reached over and tapped the screen of his tablet. He slid it across the long table toward her. Sarah looked down. It was a video. A shaky, zoomed-in cell phone recording taken from the crowd at the intersection. It showed Sarah swinging the tire iron. It showed the glass shattering. It showed her pulling Rosa from the smoke. This video has 1 million views. Dominic said, his voice flat. It is on every local news station. You are the hero of Southside, which means to the Morettis, you are the complication that ruined a $1 million hit. I'm just a waitress, Sarah whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. They don't care about me. They care about leverage, Dominic corrected. The Morettis are embarrassed. They look weak. You are a civilian who humiliated their street soldiers by doing what they couldn't undo. They will find you, Sarah. They will use you to get to me, or they will simply kill you to prove a point. Panic, hot and suffocating, flared in Sarah's chest. You're lying. You're just trying to scare me into taking the money. Dominic didn't blink. He tapped the tablet again, swiping to a new image. It was a high-resolution photograph taken in the dark. It showed the front door of Sarah's apartment building. Parked across the street was a rusted grey sedan. 2 men sat inside, their faces illuminated by the glow of a lit cigarette. My men took this an hour ago, Dominic said. Those are Moretti enforcers. They are watching your building. They are likely watching the diner. Sarah stared at the photo. Her breathing turned shallow. The spreadsheet of her life, the rent, the diner, the exhaustion was suddenly ripped to shreds, replaced by a raw, primal need to survive. What do I do? She asked, the words tasting like ash. You don't go home, Dominic said. It wasn't a suggestion. I have a debt to you. I protect what is mine, and I protect those who protect my family. You will stay here, at the estate. No! Sarah said, instantly pushing away from the table. I can't. I have a job. I have a life. You have an eviction notice and a target on your back, Dominic countered coldly. If you go back to the South Side, you will be dead by Friday. I am not offering you a choice, Miss Hayes. I am informing you of your new reality. You can't just kidnap me! Sarah yelled, the sheer absurdity and terror of the situation breaking her composure. Do not be dramatic, Rosa intervened softly. No one is kidnapping you, Sarah. Dominic is keeping you breathing. Sarah looked at the frail old woman, then at the mob boss who looked at her like she was a tactical problem to be solved. She thought of Tom. She had fought so hard to keep him alive, only to lose him to a failing heart. She wasn't going to let herself be killed by some street thugs over a grudge she had no part in. I can't just vanish, Sarah said, her voice shaking but her jaw set. If I don't show up to work, Gary fires me. If I get fired, I have absolutely nothing left. I will handle your employer. Dominic said. No. Sarah slammed her hand on the table. The sudden noise echoed in the large room. Dominic's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine surprise crossing his features. You don't threaten him. Gary is a good man. He's let me slide on being late a dozen times. You don't touch him. Dominic studied her for a long moment. He was used to people cowering. He was used to people begging. He wasn't used to a £110 waitress dictating terms. Victor will call your manager, Dominic said slowly. He will explain that you have accepted a lucrative live-in position as a private caretaker for my grandmother. He will offer your diner a significant anonymous donation to cover the inconvenience of your sudden departure. Is that acceptable? Sarah swallowed hard. It was a neat, clean lie. It severed her from her old life without leaving a bloody trail. What about my things? She asked quietly. My husband's photos, his ashes. Victor will secure your apartment tonight. Dominic said. Your belongings will be brought here. Sarah looked down at the untouched plate of pasta in front of her. She had walked into this house a broke, desperate woman trying to hold on to her pride. She was walking out of this dining room as a prisoner. She reached across the table, grabbed the cream-colored envelope containing the $200,000 check, and shoved it back across the wood toward Dominic. Keep the money, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a bitter whisper. Consider it my rent. The guest suite in the east wing of the Gallo estate was larger than Sarah's entire apartment. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, a king-sized bed with linens that felt like woven clouds, and a marble bathroom equipped with a rain shower. It was beautiful. It was immaculate. It was a cell. 3 days had passed since the dinner. 3 days of profound, agonizing boredom. Victor had delivered her belongings in 2 cardboard boxes. Tom's ashes, kept in a modest wooden urn, now sat on a mahogany mantelpiece beneath a painting that probably cost more than Tom made in his lifetime. The juxtaposition made Sarah sick to her stomach. She wasn't allowed outside the estate walls. She wasn't allowed to use her cell phone. Dominic had confiscated it, citing GPS tracking risks. He handed her a secure, encrypted burner phone with exactly 2 numbers programmed into it, Victor's and his own. Sarah spent her mornings walking the manicured gardens, shadowed constantly by 2 silent men in suits. She spent her afternoons reading in the massive library. But mostly she felt the phantom weight of her diner apron around her neck. She missed the burn of the coffee pots. She missed the terrible, predictable math of her old life. On the 4th morning, the silence broke her. She marched out of her suite, ignoring the security detail that immediately fell into step behind her, and navigated the maze of corridors until she found Dominic's office. The door was heavy oak, cracked open just enough for her to hear the low hum of voices. She didn't knock. She pushed it open. Dominic was standing behind a massive glass desk looking over architectural blueprints. 3 other men capos, she assumed, were seated around the room. The moment Sarah stepped in, the conversation died. 4 pairs of hardened, violent eyes snapped to her. Dominic didn't flinch. He slowly rolled up the blueprints. Gentlemen, give us a minute. The men stood up, shooting sideways glances at Sarah as they filed out of the room. When the heavy door clicked shut, Dominic leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. He wore a fitted black turtleneck that emphasized the broadness of his shoulders. You don't knock, he observed. I'm going crazy, Sarah said, stepping further into the office. I can't do this. I can't just sit in that room and stare at the ocean while your guys follow me like a lost dog. You are safe, Dominic replied smoothly. That is the objective. I am a pet, Sarah shot back. I'm used to working. I'm used to moving. You took my job, you took my home, and you put me in a box. A really expensive box, but a box. Dominic tilted his head slightly, studying her. The irritation he usually showed when challenged was absent. Instead, there was a quiet, analytical curiosity. What exactly do you want, Sarah? You want to go back to scrubbing grease off griddles? You want to go back to ducking your landlord? I want a purpose, she said firmly. I want to do something. If I'm stuck here, put me to work. Dominic scoffed quietly. You want to work for me? What are you going to do, run numbers, extort local businesses? I know how to balance a ledger. Sarah fired back, refusing to back down. I ran the inventory and payroll for the diner for 3 years, because Gary couldn't use Excel to save his life. I know how to stretch a dollar. I know when suppliers are skimming off the top. Dominic paused. The cynical amusement faded from his eyes. The Gallo family ran legitimate businesses, ports, construction, real estate to wash their money. And legitimate businesses required meticulous, boring, tedious oversight. The kind of oversight his street soldiers despised. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. He stopped just a foot away from her. Up close he smelled of sandalwood, and something distinctly cold like ozone. You are offering to touch my books, Dominic said, his voice dropping in volume. It was a dangerous proposition. Knowing the family's finances meant knowing their vulnerabilities. I'm offering to do paperwork so I don't lose my mind, Sarah corrected, looking up into his flint-colored eyes. She didn't step back. I saved your grandmother's life. You said that means something to you, so trust me enough to give me a damn calculator. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. Sarah could see the pulse beating steadily in Dominic's neck. She realized with a sudden jolt of adrenaline that this was a test. If she blinked, if she looked away, he would dismiss her forever. Dominic's jaw shifted. He turned his back on her, walking over to a massive steel filing cabinet in the corner of the office. He unlocked it with a key from his pocket, pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, and dropped it onto the glass desk with a heavy thud. This is the operational budget for a front company, Dominic said, not looking at her. A mid-tier shipping logistics firm downtown. It is bleeding money. The manager claims it's supply chain inflation. I think he's skimming. Sarah walked over to the desk. She looked at the ledger, then at Dominic. Find the leak, Dominic commanded. You have 48 hours. If you find it, you have a job. If you don't, you go back to your room and you sit quietly until the Moretti problem is solved. Sarah reached out and pulled the heavy ledger toward her. The leather was cold under her fingertips. It wasn't diner payroll. It was mob money. It was blood money. But as she opened the cover and saw the familiar rows of columns and numbers, a wave of profound relief washed over her. It was a puzzle. It was a task. It was something she could control in a world that had completely spiraled out of her grasp. I'll have it by tomorrow morning, Sarah said quietly. She turned and walked out of the office, clutching the ledger to her chest. She didn't see the way Dominic watched her leave, not as a debt and not as a liability. He watched her as if he had just found something incredibly valuable and profoundly dangerous. For 8 straight hours, the only sound in the cavernous guest suite was the scratching of a graphite pencil against legal paper. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, the heavy leather ledger open on the glass coffee table before her. She had stripped off her leather jacket and rolled up the sleeves of her blouse. 4 empty espresso cups sat in a neat row near the edge of the table. She didn't know the shipping industry. She didn't know the going rate for a shipping container, the tariffs on international freight, or the standard depreciation of a commercial truck. But she knew poverty. She knew how people hid things when the money got tight. She knew the desperate, predictable math of a lie. The manager, a man named Paulie, wasn't smart. He was just arrogant. He assumed the men reviewing his books were gangsters looking for bottom-line profits, not accountants looking for structural discrepancies. He was inflating fuel costs. That was the obvious skim the surface-level grift meant to distract from the real hemorrhage. Sarah ignored the fuel. She followed the maintenance logs. Paulie was authorizing major transmission overhauls on trucks that had just been purchased 6 months prior. He was routing the payments to a third-party mechanic shop on the north side of the city. Sarah spent 3 hours cross-referencing the license plates in the ledger with the maintenance schedules. The trucks supposedly sitting in the shop for weeks were simultaneously logging thousands of miles on the highway fuel logs. They were ghost invoices. At 6 a.m. the sun began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, pale shadows across the carpet. Sarah rubbed her eyes. They were dry and burning. Her right hand, still wrapped in gauze, throbbed with a dull ache from holding the pencil. She gathered her notes. 3 pages of meticulous, undeniable evidence. She walked down the silent, carpeted hallways of the estate. The night shift security guards watched her pass, their expressions impassive, but she felt the weight of their stares. She didn't care. She had a job to do. Dominic's office door was shut. She knocked once, a sharp, hard rap, and opened it before waiting for a response. Dominic was sitting behind his desk. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, a shadow of dark stubble lining his jaw. A glass of amber liquid sat half empty near his right hand. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Sarah walked over and dropped her legal pads on top of the glass desk. "It's not supply chain inflation," Sarah said. Her voice was raspy from disuse and too much caffeine. "And it's not just a skim. He's draining the company." Dominic picked up the first page. His eyes scanned the neat, cramped handwriting. "Show me." "Look at the third column." Sarah instructed, stepping around the desk to point at the paper. She stood close enough to smell the scotch on his breath and the stale coffee in the room. "He's billing you for phantom repairs. He uses a shell mechanic shop to wash the funds. The trucks never leave the rotation. He's siphoning $80,000 a month minimum." Dominic's finger traced the line of numbers. His jaw flexed. The subtle movement was the only indication of the violence brewing beneath his skin. 80,000. Dominic repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Since October," Sarah confirmed. She tapped the bottom of the page. "But that's not the worst part. I looked at the routing numbers for the mechanic shop. It's a local credit union. The same credit union that handles the payroll for the diner I work at. Gary talks about it all the time because the owner is a regular." Dominic looked up at her. His eyes were like chipped ice. "Who is the owner?" "A guy named Vincent Moretti." The silence in the office became absolute. The air pressure seemed to drop. Dominic stood up slowly. He towered over her, but Sarah didn't take a step back. She held his gaze. She saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Paulie wasn't just stealing. He was funding the enemy. He was paying the very people who had tried to cook Rosa alive in an armored car. "You found this in one night," Dominic stated. It wasn't a question. "I know how to track a missing dollar," Sarah said evenly. "When you spend your whole life terrified of overdraft fees, you learn how to read a balance sheet." Dominic looked at the notes again, then back to Sarah. The cold detachment he usually wore slipped, revealing a stark, intense respect. It wasn't the way a man looked at a captive. It was the way a general looked at a lieutenant. "Get some sleep, Sarah," Dominic said. He reached past her, picking up his desk phone. He hit a single button. "Victor, assemble a crew. We have a rat to trap." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, her stomach suddenly tightening. She had found the numbers. The reality of what those numbers meant in this world was crashing down on her. Dominic paused, the phone pressed to his ear. He looked at her, his expression utterly devoid of mercy. "I am going to balance the ledger." Sarah didn't sleep. She lay on top of the king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the estate. At noon, she heard the heavy rumble of engines. She walked to the window and watched a convoy of 4 black SUVs roll down the long driveway, disappearing past the iron gates. Dominic was gone. The estate felt empty, hollowed out. Victor had stayed behind with a skeleton crew of 6 men. It was Sunday. The ocean breeze whipped against the reinforced glass of her window, carrying the scent of salt and impending rain. At 4 p.m. the storm broke. Thunder rattled the window panes. At 4:15 p.m. the power went out. The transition was instant. The subtle hum of the central air conditioning died. The lamps blinked out. The only light came from the bruised purple sky outside. Sarah sat up, her pulse spiking. A blackout wasn't entirely unusual in a storm, but the timing felt wrong. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. She stood up and walked toward the bedroom door. Before her hand touched the brass knob, a sound echoed through the massive house. It was a dull, rhythmic thud. It didn't come from the sky. It came from the front gates. Thud. Crunch. Someone was ramming the iron barricade. Sarah threw the door open. The hallway was pitch black, save for the faint grey light filtering through the distant arched windows. She heard shouting on the first floor, Victor's voice sharp and commanding. Then the unmistakable, deafening crack of a gunshot. It wasn't like the movies. It didn't echo neatly. It was a sharp, concussive blast that hurt her ears and made her teeth vibrate. Moretti's men hadn't waited for Dominic to come to them. Paulie had tipped them off. They knew the estate was lightly guarded. Sarah didn't freeze. Panic was a luxury for people who had a safety net. She had none. She sprinted down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. She didn't go towards the stairs. She went towards the west wing. Rosa. She found the older woman in her private sitting room. Rosa was sitting in a high-backed armchair, staring calmly out the window at the pouring rain. A heavy, silver-plated revolver rested on her lap. She looked entirely unbothered. They breached the gate. Sarah gasped, leaning against the doorframe, her chest heaving. I heard, Rosa said calmly. She didn't look at Sarah. The Morettis are impatient. It is a family trait. Their father was the same way. All fire, no discipline. We have to hide, Sarah said, stepping into the room. The sound of automatic gunfire erupted downstairs. Glass shattered, a cascading crash that echoed up the grand staircase. I do not hide in my own home, Rosa said, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. You're 80 years old and you use a cane, Sarah snapped, crossing the room and grabbing Rosa by the arm. The sudden disrespect shocked the older woman enough that she didn't resist as Sarah pulled her to her feet. I didn't break my hand pulling you out of an oven just to let you get shot in your living room. Move! Rosa glared at her, but she gripped her cane and let Sarah lead her out into the hallway. Where? Rosa demanded, her breath hitching slightly as they moved as quickly as her fragile legs would allow. The library, Sarah said. I saw a heavy oak door in the back. Looks like a service corridor. It doesn't have windows. They navigated the dark, sprawling upper floor. The air was quickly filling with the sharp, acidic smell of cordite and pulverized drywall. The gunfire downstairs was erratic, brutal. Men were screaming. They reached the library. Sarah pushed the heavy double doors open, shoving Rosa inside. She locked the deadbolt behind them, knowing it was largely symbolic against men with assault rifles. She guided Rosa to the back of the room, behind a massive, towering bookshelf built into the wall. Sit, Sarah ordered, pushing Rosa down to the floor. Sarah crouched beside her in the suffocating darkness. She reached out and took the heavy revolver from Rosa's trembling lap. The steel was freezing. Sarah had never held a gun in her life. It felt grotesque, an alien weight in her hands. Is the safety off? Sarah whispered. There is no safety on a revolver. Rosa murmured, her voice finally betraying a sliver of fear. Just pull the trigger. Do not close your eyes. Heavy footsteps thumped on the hardwood floor of the hallway outside the library. Boots, too many of them. The doorknob rattled. Sarah raised the gun, aiming it at the darkness where the doorway was. Her arms shook violently. She braced her injured hand against her left wrist. She thought of the eviction notice. She thought of Tom. She thought of the sheer absurd unfairness that she was going to die in a billionaire's mansion over a feud she didn't understand. Bang! A shotgun blast tore through the library doors. Splinters of wood showered the room. The doors were kicked open. Flashlight beams sliced through the darkness, illuminating the dust in the air. "Check the corners," a rough voice barked. Sarah held her breath. Her finger rested heavily on the trigger. The beam of a flashlight swept across the room, inching closer to the bookshelf. She prepared to fire. She knew she would miss. She knew she would die. Before the light hit them, a new sound erupted from the hallway. It was a wet, sickening crunch. A man screamed the sound, cutting off abruptly in a gurgle. The flashlight beam dropped to the floor, rolling crazily across the Persian rug. Gunfire exploded in the hallway, but it was close quarters. Frantic, Sarah peered around the edge of the bookshelf. In the dim light of the hallway, she saw a shadow moving with terrifying mechanical efficiency. It was Dominic. He didn't use a gun. He had a hunting knife in one hand and a suppressed pistol in the other. He moved like a ghost through the smoke and darkness. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He was a predator entirely in his element. Within 30 seconds, the hallway was dead silent. Sarah lowered the revolver, her arms dropping to her sides. She felt dizzy. Dominic stepped into the library. He picked up one of the dropped flashlights and shined it away from them, illuminating the floor so they could see. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was soaked in blood plastered to his chest. His knuckles were raw and split. He looked at Sarah, then down at Rosa. He dropped the pistol and the knife onto a reading table and dropped to his knees in front of his grandmother. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a ragged rasp. "I am fine, Dominic," Rosa said. She reached out her trembling hand, touching his blood-soaked cheek. "Your suit is ruined." Dominic let out a short, hollow laugh. He looked up at Sarah. She was still sitting on the floor, the heavy revolver resting on her knee, staring at the blood dripping from his hands. "You found the back door," Dominic said softly, looking at the service corridor she had been aiming at. "I was going to shoot them," Sarah whispered, the shock finally setting in. Her teeth chattered. Dominic reached out. He didn't take the gun. He placed his large, warm hand over hers, steadying the violent trembling. "I know," Dominic said. "You don't have to anymore." The estate smelled of bleach and ozone. It was Tuesday morning. The bodies had been cleared before sunrise. The blood had been scrubbed from the hardwood floors, the shattered glass swept away. The gates were being welded back together by a private contracting crew. In the underworld, a war had been fought and finished in the span of 36 hours. Vincent Moretti was dead. Paulie was dead. The threat was neutralized. Sarah stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the guest suite, watching the contractors work. She wore her old clothes, the dark jeans, and the black blouse. Her cheap vinyl purse sat on the bed next to Tom's wooden urn. A soft knock on the door frame made her turn. Dominic stood in the doorway. He wore a fresh navy suit, immaculate and crisp. The only sign of the violence from 2 nights ago was a dark bruise along his jawline and a bandage wrapped around his right hand. "Victor is downstairs," Dominic said. His tone was formal, guarded. "The car is waiting." Sarah nodded slowly. She walked over to the bed and picked up her purse. "Where is he taking me?" "Wherever you want to go," Dominic replied. "The Morettis are no longer a concern. Your manager at the diner believes you took a family emergency leave. Your apartment is secured. You are free to return to your life, Sarah." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a fresh cream-colored envelope. He held it out to her. 200,000, Dominic said. "Clean money, untraceable. It is not a debt. It is a severance package. You earned it." Sarah stared at the envelope. She thought of the diner. She thought of the smell of stale grease, the grinding ache of a 60-hour work week, the neon-pink eviction notices, the constant suffocating fear of a broken water heater or a flat tire. That was her world. It was safe. It was legal. It was entirely devoid of men bleeding out in hallways. She looked at Dominic. She saw the man who had ordered executions, who manipulated cities, who lived in a fortress of his own making. But she also saw the man who had dropped to his knees on boiling asphalt for his grandmother, the man who had trusted a waitress with his books, the man who had steadied her shaking hands in the dark. Sarah walked toward him. She stopped a foot away. She didn't take the envelope. "I looked at the rest of the ledger before the power went out." Sarah said, her voice steady. Dominic lowered the envelope slightly. "And the shipping company isn't the only thing bleeding," she said, crossing her arms. "Your construction front is overpaying for raw materials by 15%. The suppliers are gouging you because your men don't cross-check the market rates. You're losing $250,000 a year on drywall and steel alone." Dominic stared at her. The formal guarded mask slipped entirely. "You memorize the supply line budgets. I have a good memory for bad math," Sarah said. Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. "What are you saying, Sarah?" Dominic asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm saying the diner is a dead end," Sarah replied, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm saying I spent my whole life being a victim of numbers I couldn't control. I don't want to go back to scrubbing griddles. I want to manage the ledger." Dominic stepped closer. The scent of sandalwood and cold air surrounded her. "This isn't a game. You know what we do. You saw it." "I saw survival," Sarah corrected bluntly. "I saved your grandmother. You saved my life. The debt is settled. If I stay on payroll. My terms. I get an office. I get full access to the operational budgets. And I don't touch the violence." Dominic studied her face. He looked for the fear, for the hesitation. He found neither. He found the hardened, cynical grit of a woman who had finally decided to stop fighting the current and build a dam instead. Slowly the corner of Dominic's mouth twitched upward. It was a genuine smile. It changed his entire face, making him look less like a kingpin and more like a man who had just won a lottery he hadn't bought a ticket for. He slowly lowered the envelope, sliding it back into his pocket. "Victor," Dominic called out, not taking his eyes off Sarah. Footsteps approached down the hall. Victor appeared in the doorway, glancing between them. "Yes, boss." "Cancel the car," Dominic said, "and have a desk moved into the West Wing study. Miss Hayes is taking over the accounts." Victor hid his surprise well. He gave a sharp nod. "Understood." Victor walked away. Dominic and Sarah stood alone in the doorway. There was no sweeping romance, no dramatic declarations, just an ironclad understanding forged in blood ledgers and shattered glass. "You start tomorrow at 8, Dominic said. "I'll need espresso," Sarah replied. "Done." Sarah finally allowed herself a small, tired smile. She turned back to the room, unclasped her cheap vinyl purse, and set it down on the mahogany table. She wasn't a captive anymore. She was exactly where she chose to be. If you loved this story of grit survival and a mafia romance that breaks all the rules, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this video with your fellow book lovers and romance addicts. Want more intense, grounded stories where the heroine actually fights back? Make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the money or stayed to run the mob's ledgers? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.